Hi, everyone. Welcome to KickoffLabs On Growth. This week is going to be a founder chat where Scott and I talk about performance. We recently had a push to optimize the page speed and load times on the KickoffLabs marketing site, application, and the landing pages KickoffLabs generates for its customers. We learned a lot, and I wanted to share this information with you because it's going to help you build better landing pages with higher conversion rates, online stores that people want to shop at, and apps that people enjoy using because it just feels snappier. This is episode 4, and I hope you enjoy it. There's a note here to talk about what's new, and I added that, and I was going to have Scott go first, but I'll just start. So this week, in the last week, I started playing baseball again for the first time in 3 years. And I am now extremely sore after playing one game on Sunday. So I don't know if you have any advice for that, Scott.
Just motivation. You're watching the Yankees, really got you excited to get back into baseball.
Yeah, they do have team spirit. I'll give them that.
No, I have nothing. I told you I played basketball for the last couple of years, and then I think recently retired because kept getting injured and had no idea how he was getting injured. So my recommendation is probably don't do it. But
yeah, I'm going to see if I can avoid getting injured. Right now, I'm just feeling the pain of doing something I hadn't done in a long time. So like I said, today we're going to talk to you about performance. And I want to talk a little bit about why that's important to think about. And when I talk about performance, specifically in this episode, we're talking about site speed, how long it takes a website or an app to load. And so in this case, one of the reasons we looked at it is a good 40% of our landing page views of people coming to our marketing site were from mobile devices. And that was especially true for places that we advertise. So in ads on Facebook and Twitter, people are coming over from mobile devices because that's where they're browsing those things, and that's where they're clicking the ads. And they may later come back and sign up on a desktop, but I want their first experience to be something that feels fast, because I think that plays a lot into customer perception. If something comes up slow, they're going to have a slow perception of your whole site, app, or your store. And that's based on some research. I used to work ages ago at Microsoft. And I remember seeing the research that basically said if the application started slow, people thought the whole thing was slow. It didn't matter how fast things actually were. But if this started slow, the perception is your whole thing was just not worth waiting for. SEO is another good reason, search engine optimization. Google does now they want to reward faster pages. And the last one is, just consider that, you as a founder, marketer on the internet somewhere, you probably have a decently fast internet connection. I know I do. And what we see on the internet isn't necessarily the experience of a lot of your potential customers when they look at your store or your app or your landing pages there.
Or even your hardware performance, right? I mean, you probably, as someone who's starting a company, especially a web company, you probably have a newer computer, like you said, a better, bigger monitor, and those kinds of things, a better video card, or maybe you have a video card, and all those things can make your app seem quick and seem fast and speedy, but to your typical end users, it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good note, especially the thing about the hardware is I think both of us are on fairly recent high-end MacBook Pros, and that's probably not the case for a lot of people out there. So my first note, and this comes from looking at a lot of our own customer pages and their landing pages and what they're attempting to do, is called, I say, right size your images. Big images equal a big download time. And I think what this comes from, and where I see it a lot with our customers, is people go and they look for a stock photo of something to use. And these stock photo sites have started offering extremely large versions of the photo. I mean, versions of the photo you could print and put on, a 25-foot tall billboard outside of Times Square, when what you are using the photo for is maybe like a headshot on your landing page or your website somewhere. And that headshot is maybe, 500 pixels, maybe, and, thinking about it, looking at a website like an inch wide, and you're using a photo that's, made to be 25 inches or on a 32-inch monitor, blown up and looked at. And that causes a lot of bandwidth, and the browser just stops and it starts downloading these large images, and it causes people's pages to look slow. The images don't load, and then if there's text in front of the image, then that doesn't look right. That was my first big note. And also just introduce the first tool to help people check these things out. If you Google online, you just Google for the Google Pagespeed Analyzer. That's just a really simple tool. You can just enter in a website and it'll pull up a report that shows you a bunch of these other things we'll talk about. But also one of the top things it shows is images that aren't that are probably too big and are taking up a lot of download time.
Yeah. And the other images, I guess, somewhat more recent trend, for images is this might even be our first. I can't even think of the way of saying it. Our first decisive point or whatever is a GIF or GIF. Would be the animated ISA GIF, but animated GIFs they are increasingly getting more complicated and they're getting bigger. I think we had one customer we were just analyzing our own logs, and we just saw a huge uptake in traffic, and it's just because someone had uploaded a massive GIF that they were using in their pages, and it was just eating a lot of bandwidth. But I can imagine that was a large file to be downloaded and a slow file to be downloaded for a lot of end users. So
yeah, absolutely. They and the tools to generate these the GIFs are definitely vary in terms of what kind of quality and size they produce. I mean, I used a default tool. I used Droppler as a tool for taking screenshots, and started using that at first for some GIFs we were using for support, and then realized that it was doing such a high frame rate and resolution. Even a short 5-second little animated GIF was huge, until I had to end up using getting Camtasia, a much more a larger tool, mostly for video editing. But they had the control over the export of a GIF that would let me say I wanted it to be less than this size, and it would say, okay, well, you're going to have to reduce the resolution by this much and reduce the frame rate by this much. But it helped me find a happy medium for the image that I wanted to help people with support.
Yeah, the website Giphy has a really nice, at least for a Mac, app that has a lot of stuff like that. But even the same thing, by default, the files it generates are huge, but there is control, if I remember correctly, to tune that into something much more realistic. So,
on to you for our second point.
So our second point we have listed is performance is an art versus science, and I think part of that, what I was getting at, is that, and you had mentioned this in your intro, is that a lot of it's just a perception of speed. So a couple of years ago, we started using a tool on our main marketing, on our main application site called TurboLinks, and that just it just gives us a perception of pages loading quicker because you're not loading everything with the page. You're only loading essentially the middle part that changes. But then customers don't have to wait for the JavaScript files and CSS and everything to be re-downloaded and parsed. And so nothing is really happening quicker on our servers. It's just quicker in a browser, and it gives that big performance or perception of performance. And then the other one was kind of like a walk back in time. We've been doing this now for about 8 years, but I remember when we first started making deployments to our main app. And we were new and we were deploying all the time throughout the day. And I remember trying to optimize on when to do deployments because it would take time for we use Rails behind the scenes. And it would take time for our app to load, and we wanted it, again, it's nothing we were doing slow, but it's just every time we did a deployment, the whole app needed to restart, and it just made the pages feel like they were kind of dragging on. And Heroku, where also we host our app had a feature that came out a while ago, and now it's pretty standard, but it's called pre-boot. And that was the idea of, we did a deployment and Heroku would spin up our app on the side. And once it was ready to go, they would kind of then switch it out. And so for our end users, the app never slowed down. Everything kept going. And it gave us the option to, keep deploying throughout the day and not having to think about, is now a good time to deploy, or do we want to wait till, 5 o'clock East Coast time, or do we want to deploy at 5 o'clock West Coast time, or overnight, and all those things that just, make for a miserable experience.
It's interesting as you progress on the journey, the different things you learn about how people move through your app and use your app, and where you've got the bottlenecks, and you'll come across areas. I mean, we've come across a bunch where it's like, oh, didn't know this would be a bottleneck, and then of course it is, and you optimize it and make that part faster, and find the next piece to keep that perception high of the performance. So my next note was cut JavaScripts and styles, that would be the CSS, on websites that you aren't using, and consider cutting ones that you think, even the ones that you think are required. And so it's kind of two notes here. So we moved our marketing site for KickoffLabs.com off of WordPress to a static site. And one of the reasons we did that, I mean, we'd had a WordPress site forever at the journey. And I think we were on now our, sort of second and a half overridden WordPress theme. So it was a WordPress theme on top of a WordPress theme, probably on top of some custom styles. And the reality was, when we started looking at this using some tools that analyze the CSSs and the scripts, is we weren't using most of it. The second piece I'll talk about is a little bit of the complexity of having WordPress. But the reality is, when we went through and removed the scripts that we weren't using on the site, so we basically started from scratch again, almost on a new site, new marketing site, and only including the things that we were actually needed and used on the page to verify an email address, or the scripts to run a credit card, or we did want to use Google Analytics to keep getting some basic marketing data on the site. We went from a score of around 40% in a page analyzer to around 98% on the key pages on our marketing site. And that was a huge difference in terms of how quickly the site comes up. Like I said in the beginning, on mobile phones, it comes up much faster. It feels quicker. And when I say things you think are required, I find a lot of time customers include things on their sites and pages to do things like rotating a video image, and they use these massive libraries. And I don't think people realize how big some of the JavaScripts they include on their pages are. But when they include, jQuery and then all these other JavaScript plugins on top of plugins, just to do a really simple task, the first question I was asked is, do you even really need the image rotator or that script? And the second question is, and you'll get to in a bit, is like, are there simpler ways to do that kind of thing on your site? And we found a bunch of places where we just had simpler ways of doing something, simpler ways of conveying the message on the marketing site. And in the end, it also just makes it easier for us to maintain.
So I think that's the key too, especially when you talk with moving from WordPress to something else. It's just the long-term, maintenance, of the entire process and project. I just think it just gets simpler for you when you have less moving pieces, when you're not relying on someone else's, code like that, at runtime, and it just makes life easier for you. So one of the ways we really help the marketing site is we use a library called Purge CSS, because we were using Bootstrap, and it goes through and cuts out, I don't remember what the numbers were, but it was something like 70 or 80% or more. Bootstrap's a great framework, and there's a lot of websites built with it. There's a lot you can do with it. But at the end of the day, most people don't need, all of Bootstrap. You need just, you might be using a grid, you might be using some buttons, you just need a fraction of it. And so Purge CSS goes through and then removes, looks at all the CSS you're using, and what you're not using, and cuts it out. one of the good things we did recently is we moved to we upgraded to Rails 5.2, which has support for Webpack. And so one of the things we're working on now is bringing those same changes that we did to leverage Purge CSS and some stuff like that, and bring it into our main app. Like today, we only get the benefit, on a marketing site, but going forward in the coming weeks, we should be able to do have similar changes that we can make on our main app. And then be able to push those changes out as well. So,
yeah, and then you have the next node as well.
We're gonna have to work in these transitions.
Yeah.
So from a pure app perspective, one of the things we did, and again, this is 7 or 8 years ago, it wasn't nearly as common as it is today, but that's using background workers. So we do everything humanly possible within our app. We push to the background, and so for even a small small company and small team like ourselves, we're still doing millions of these just micro little tasks in the background. But it gives us the ability to to keep the app from an end user's perspective moving rather quickly. It enables us to capture signups quickly on our customer landing pages, because again, we do the bare minimum we have to. When someone signs up, we capture the data, we put it in the database, and then we're able to just throw off a whole bunch of jobs, as far as validating the user and sending emails out, scoring the users, tracking points, all those things happen in the background. And again, it just makes it much easier for us to kind of manage, and the perception of it being quick is there because we do something like 20 or 30 individual, just looking at from when our customers capture a lead, there's 20 or 30 things that happen every time we capture a lead, but we don't need to make someone signing up wait for us to go through and dot all those I's and cross all those T's. We can get back to them quickly.
Moving on to the back to a customer, like the very front-facing side of things, are the fonts that people see. From my perspective, and we'll probably do a whole nother podcast on design of landing pages and fonts. When I see a landing page with not just multiple fonts, but just with the transitions between, even if you only have 2 or 3 fonts on the page, but you've got one of them giant, one of them medium, then another one giant, and then some italics and some red and some yellow. And people do this all the time. It's just visually disconcerting. And it would just look much better if you stuck to more of a traditional, just, there's a headline and there's some paragraph text and there's, a font that you use for both of those things. I read that 67% of websites now use some sort of custom font, which or web font, which means that it's not something that's on your customer's computer to begin with. That would be a web safe font. And so you have to download these things. And so the more fonts you put on a page, the more different web fonts you put on the page, the more people have to download. And the more often, if you ever see loading a website and you see this blank page where there should be text, they're not loading a safe font first for those fonts, and it's waiting to download the larger font before it shows up. And if people can't read what you're trying to sell them, then they can't buy what you're trying to sell them, and it creates this perception again of performance. And so my recommendation is just to we're not going to unring the bell of people using downloading fonts if it's at 67% of the web is using a custom font, but to consider, instead of using 3, maybe you only need to load 1 custom font on the page, or instead of using 5, go down to 2 on the page. And just that little bit of reduction can make a difference. You can also now in modern browsers, you can tell them to preload the fonts and move it up higher on the page stack, so it's loading first. That does come at a cost, because then it won't load the content till later. And so it's a little bit of a trade-off, but you can do preloading on fonts as well.
Yeah. And I'll throw into things like, Font Awesome. It looks like this great way of getting a whole bunch of icons on the screen, but you pay a price for that. And then I've seen now people are using multiple, I guess different versions of font, not different versions of Font Awesome, but just other icon fonts. And all these things come at a cost. One of the neat things I saw you mentioned in the beginning about people using, a font for just a headline, is that I know Google does this with their fonts, and I don't know if any of the other hosting providers do it, but they'll let you to kind of speed things up a little bit more too. You can tell it, hey, I want to use this font, and you can pass in the query string, like the phrase you're going to use, right? If you're just using it for just one particular headline, and they'll optimize it so that way that font you download is a version that just contains those 5 letters. Or if you're using one for your logo, you can tell it, here's the 4 unique characters for my logo, or 5 or whatever it is, and they'll optimize a font, just for that. And that's, you're still making a request and still paying the price, but at least you're minimizing it and kind of slimming it down a bit more.
Yeah, that's a really good bit of advice. I saw that advice on fonts is not just picking smaller fonts, but that you can request in most services now that subset of the characters. So if you only need a few of the characters, you can be a much smaller download for people.
Especially for like headlines and logos and that kind of stuff where you have a lot of control over it.
Yeah. And you mentioned Font Awesome. It was funny. We went through that on the marketing site, and I was seeing like, how do I shave this extra half second off the load? And I was looking at it being Font Awesome, and I looked at the marketing site. So what are we using Font Awesome for? And it turned out we were only using it in the footer to link to the Kickoff Labs Twitter and Facebook pages. I said, well, that's an easy thing to cut. So we cut the icons out, and now it just says Twitter and Facebook at the bottom, which in some ways I think is actually more usable. And we were able to cut the whole dependency on the marketing site having Font Awesome.
Yeah, I know in my own personal blog, I made a similar decision, and I just went with like inline SVGs. And again, you get all the same benefit, and it's kind of right in line. Probably out of context for us too, but the other thing Font Awesome too is just to look at the usability and accessibility of things like that too. It doesn't always come through the way you'd expect it to on screen readers and smaller devices. So.
I can't remember what we were going to talk about next, Scott.
Oh, well, we have a list right in front of us, so we'll keep scrolling through. So I had for my next one was memory monitoring, or just monitoring in general. So this kind of, maybe this is one we could have started with, but one of the hard things to do when you performance monitoring is knowing when something went wrong. Was it with a deployment? Was it something that happened recently? Was it a change in dependency? And I always say I kick myself because we didn't really do enough of this monitoring. We were just getting started. And when you look at memory graphs and CPU usage and those kinds of things, it's hard to know if we've gone back, if we've made a lot of improvement, where things change, because we don't have a great starting point for when we started using these tools. So I guess this kind of just as a tip for any app that when you're just getting started. We use an app today called Scout that watches all this stuff for us, and just to have that up and running from the beginning. Will give you, you'll at least know where you are from day one, and it'll make it easier to follow the changes you made, what improvements you made, if you've done something. Again, the big thing is, did you deploy something, or did you make an underlying change that's out of your control, and that adversely affects, your performance in some way. So for our case, it would be, a gem dependency that we use, a different version of Rails, a different version of Ruby, and those types of things.
Yeah, we do need to work on these transitions because I don't know how to start the next part. Did you like my memory introduction though? That was good, right?
Yes. We'll get better, people. We'll get better. I promise. I think I'm overly trying not to step, the step on your line. So we're gonna work on it. So.
All right. So I mentioned this earlier. We migrated our marketing site off of WordPress to a static site, which means one where the pages are just all written out to disk ahead of time. There's no database involved in our marketing site anymore. And our landing pages, the landing pages our app at Kickoff Labs we generate are all basically static pages as well that are published in advance. And so there's no database lookup when you first come to the page on the landing pages. And there were a lot of reasons to do this. The performance of that, database lookup on WordPress is one of them. We were paying, probably still are paying for a couple more months for a lot for WordPress hosting, and it felt like, we would still see these outages from time to time that were out of our control because something went wrong with the database or the database server, and it removed one more thing that could go wrong from our process or marketing site, whatever you want to call it. And I think removing that one dependency had a lot to do with it makes it simpler to maintain. It's less error prone, and for all the reasons we've talked about before, the pages are just going to be faster loading for people. And so, it might not make sense for everybody out there to do that. There's certainly some downsides. WordPress has a huge ton of publishing and workflow tools around it. Although my personal opinion is the latest WordPress editor and the latest version of WordPress was a huge step backwards. I know I'm not alone in thinking that. But there are a lot of publishing tools that people are used to, and you kind of miss out a little bit of those workflows. But I think the benefit going forward of having less overhead is clearly worth it, which leads right into your next topic.
Yeah. So less overhead, only use what you need. Yeah, I guess this one's pretty obvious as well. But to really think about dependencies you take on. So I'm talking more, I guess, from the app perspective, but it could relate to the marketing site as well, right? Because you can pull in different JavaScript frameworks and that kind of stuff. But it's very easy when you're getting started to just grab everything. I said we use Ruby and Rails for our main app, but I just remember when we first got started, coming from our backgrounds, right? We both have backgrounds in the .NET world and the Microsoft world, which has changed a lot in the last 8 years or so since we were there as well. But you come into this Ruby world where there's just gems galore. There's pre-written pieces of code that have done everything you want to do in your app, and it seems really easy to just go out and just grab these things and package it all together, and just kind of stitching it, connecting the dots as you will. But over time, we started to realize that for a lot of these gems, we're only using 20, 30 lines of code from it. I think this was most apparent on things like wrappers around like the MailChimp API and SendGrid's API and stuff like that, where to their credit, MailChimp has built this great big API, and either they or third parties have built gem wrappers around that API. But at the end of the day, we were only using a really tiny part of it, and we were paying the price both in memory for managing for having the gem load it, complexity and having another dependency. What else? And just kind of the risk of having someone else's code running within our product, where we're only using this tiny small fraction of it. And so one of the things we've been doing over the last couple of years is, wherever possible, is just extracting the pieces that we may need from those gems, or writing our own pieces, our own code that mimics a lot what they do with the API, and then just getting rid of that dependency. And that just gives us a lot less to manage long term.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier to see where problems are coming from for only doing it that way. And there's definitely a desire, I think, especially whether you're starting a new feature or a new product, to say, well, I might need to use all these things one day, and you pull it in, and then before you know it, you've pulled in a bunch of large things. And I see customers do that with their own websites too, whether it's like Shopify stores or WordPress plugins. Like, they look for like the biggest plugin they can find to do something, and they're trying to really solve a small problem. And so even if you're just like going through a WordPress plugin directory and you're looking for something that solves a problem, try and stay focused on like the very small problem that you have, rather than trying to pull in a huge solution that you're only going to use a little bit of. And something to be wary of if you're using like these plugins that we noticed on our marketing site is, because I'm not going to convince everybody to get off of WordPress, but a lot of the plugins in WordPress will pull in a whole bunch of things that you just don't realize they're pulling in, whether they're loading different marketing scripts or different locations, or whether they're loading a CSS library that you've already loaded in your location, and they're just loading a different version of it. I've seen websites with 3 to 4 different versions of Bootstrap being loaded because there's a different plugin using a different version of Bootstrap. In reality, they could probably just consolidate around just using one version of it. And the same thing with WordPress themes as well. It's just to check, make sure you're only loading and using what you need. And the last thing, speaking of loading and using what you need, this came from another recent customer support ticket at Kickoff Labs. This person had a landing page, and part of their landing page, they had a grid of 10 embedded videos on the page, all loading from YouTube. And he was emailed and he said, my landing page is really slow. Like, is there something you guys can do to speed it up? And I had to look at it and say, well, there's not much we can do to speed it up, but there's a lot you can do to speed up this landing page. And the biggest one being those 10 videos, each one of them were requests out to YouTube, were just slowing down and blocking the page. I got him down to one video, which was just his main explainer video on the page. I don't know if he actually went through the recommendation. If you do feel like you need to link to multiple videos, is just consider just linking to, see also sort of text on the videos, or just linking with preview images of the videos. So you could still have a 10 by 10 grid, but if it's 10 small thumbnail images, at least it's going to be, as long as they're right-sized images, it's going to be a lot faster than these 10 embedded videos that would be on the landing page. And just, instantly his page loaded much faster when he just went down to one embedded video on the page, and the rest of it wasn't blocking everything else. And my bonus note about this, and this isn't really about conversion optimization, is that I wouldn't be too dependent on the video if you're building a landing page for conversions. A lot of people, the videos are a nice secondary thing, but the text and images you have on the page the video should just be complementary. You should be able to get the gist of the page without the video. Imagine if, there's something wrong with the YouTube player, or it doesn't work on their mobile device, or they're at work and they can't listen to it because they don't have headphones. I see a lot of people with landing pages, so I just have to make this note, where the landing page text doesn't really say much and it just says watch the video. And there's, a lot of people will, but there's a lot of people who aren't going to watch the video, and they just want to scan the page and text and get the gist of what you're trying to market to them, what you're trying to sell to them, for them to make a decision. And just realize that when the video is not an excuse to not have good copy and text on the landing page. And that, I know, has less to do with performance, but if you got rid of even that one video, the page would load even faster. Although I do understand the videos can be helpful to sell, especially certain markets and segments.
Yeah, I'm with you. I just, think there's too many videos. I might be old, but I rarely, come across, a website, for the first time and click the play video. Usually scan to see what's going on.
Yeah, I don't think that's uncommon. I think people scan to see what's going on and on the site, and then decide if they want to get more information and watch a video. So you can't have the page without the scanning info. So that's the last performance note that we had. Let's see. What do you think of this episode, Scott?
40 some minutes. I think we'll have to work on our speed going forward as well. So we'll improve the performance next time. So we'll see.
All right. And with that, we'll stop the recording. If you have any feedback, feel free to email josh@kickofflabs.com or scott@kickofflabs.com about this episode. And I have to throw in the obligatory, please subscribe and rate in your podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Right.